and welcome to the Tao of Our Understanding Recovery Podcast. In this podcast, we discuss mystical works of literature and how they relate to recovery. We hope you enjoy today's podcast episode.
Hello, this is Buddy C. Welcome to the Tao of Our Understanding Recovery Podcast. Today we have Heidi and Marla and Craig and Chris and Dennis and Sensei. Good to have you today, sir. Glad you're here. Thank you for joining us.
Good to be had.
Good to be had. Well, that remains to be seen, so we'll see. We'll be talking about the 21st verse of the Tao Te Ching, and Sensei's going to shed some Zen light on this one today, I hope. So we'll...
I think so.
Yeah. Let's read a couple of versions. We have our announcements. Let's see. The ZoomAAmeetings.com if you're looking for a 9 p.m. Eastern online meeting. BuddyC.org has a bunch of resources, including this book, the books that we read here on the podcast. Also has a daily Tao devotion that you can sign up for. I'm taking a lot of the quotes that we use that apply to recovery and doing a quote and a thought and an affirmation associated with those. And those are pre-editor. I'm using that so that I can stay consistent about creating them. So I think I'm created through July 20th, so I've got to get busy. But good stuff. Lots of good resources for you. Good resources page there too with all kinds of other resources associated with the recovery too. So great thing to use for your sponsees or even for your sponsor if they're in need of it. So, Craig, which one you want to read today, sir?
I'll read the Gifu Fang. So verse 21, the greatest virtue is to follow Tao and Tao alone. The Tao is elusive and intangible. Oh, it is intangible and elusive, and yet within is image. Oh, it is elusive and intangible, and yet within is form. Oh, it is dim and dark, and yet within is essence. This essence is very real, and therein lies faith. From the very beginning until now, its name has never been forgotten. Thus I perceive the creation. How do I know the ways of creation? Because of this.
Thank you, sir. This is the Stephen Mitchell translation of the 21st verse. The master keeps her mind always at one with the Tao. That is what gives her her radiance. The Tao is ungraspable. How can her mind be at one with it? Because she doesn't cling to ideas. The Tao is dark and unfathomable. How can it make her radiant? Because she lets it. Since before time and space were, the Tao is. It is beyond is and is not. How do I know this is true? I look inside myself and I'll put the link up again here for anyone that came in later after I posted it in the chat. Sensei, do we want to read one of the other translations that we use?
Let me read Jonathan Starr from the book. I just came back from my eye exam, so my eyes are dilated. Everything is very radiant right now, so it must be the Tao in a chemical form.
Yeah.
Perfect. And what struck me is the difference just between this one and the Dyer. You know, those are the two I have, plus the one we have online. Again, Dyer is very, very short, and they're quite different this time. Perfect action, true virtue, supreme power. This is how Tao is revealed through those who follow it completely. Through form, though formless and intangible, it gives rise to form. Though vague and elusive, it gives rise to shapes. Though dark and obscure, it is the spirit, the essence, the life breath of all things. But is it real, you ask? I say its evidence is all of creation. From the first moment to the present, the name has been sounding. It is the gate through which the universe enters this witness by which the universe sees, the witness by which the universe sees. How have I come to know all this? The very capital N name, the very name, capital N, has told me. The name which is sounding right here, right now. So I have some comments on these. I think we have another version. I can read the Dyer version if you want. Just breathe.
Yes, that would be
He
great.
says, the greatest virtue is to follow the Tao and the Tao alone. Very similar. The Tao is elusive and intangible. Although formless and intangible, it gives rise to form. Although vague and elusive, it gives rise to shapes. Although dark and obscure, it is the spirit, the essence, the life breath of all things. So those are virtually the same, those two. And throughout the ages, its name has been preserved in order to recall the beginning of all things. How do I know the ways of all things at the beginning? I look inside myself and see what is within me. So this all sounds very Zen. Of course, Taoism was one of the sources of Zen in China.
Sensei, what's some of your thoughts?
Well, let's go back to Tao Te Ching, the Jonathan Starr version, where he says, perfect action, true virtue, supreme power. This is how the Tao is revealed through those who follow it completely. So one of the older versions of the vows we take is, however innumerable all beings are, I vow to save them all. However inexhaustible my delusions are, I vow to extinguish them all. However innumerable the Dharma teachings are, I vow to master them all. However endless the great way is, I vow to follow it completely. So right within the vows, the four great vows they're called, you have this exact same language. However infinite, really, the great way is I vow to follow it completely. So those are vows that we take or that we voice, understanding that they're basically impossible in a literal sense, but they inspire our aspiration to, give it the old college try, to do it anyway. And then when we fail, to pick ourselves up and do it again. Dogen had this famous expression, fall down 7 times, get up 8. So you might, one of the koans associated is, why didn't he just say get up 7? Why did he say get up 8? So, and then it goes on, though formless and intangible, it gives rise to form. So this is like form and emptiness in Buddhism, Buddha's original teaching of the Four Noble Truths. And the form is, I use the word innately. Form is innately emptiness, emptiness innately form. In other words, there are two things that you cannot put on opposite sides of an equation and consider them equal. They can't be separated even that much. And there's a mathematical symbol for that, which I'm not familiar with. It gives rise to form. So this is the idea that the invisible force behind everything that we experience and the appearance of the world to us is what we call form. Emptiness is what we call its essence. So I think a simple way to think of it is like matter and energy. We know that matter seems to be solid and so forth, but the scientists, physicists tell us it's a form of impounded energy. And when you look at it under an electron microscope and so forth, which they didn't have in these days back in China or Japan, but when you do, when you examine things closely, you see that it falls apart into particular components, atoms, molecules, etc., all the stuff we know, which they did not know in these days. So they're pointing at something on an intuitive level. It is formless and intangible, yet it gives rise to form. So they, in their meditation and their training, their understanding, maybe they took drugs, who knows? They had big pharmacopoeias all throughout Asia. They saw through this reality and they saw something underlying which was radiant, energetic. So they could intuitively find, it's not a sensory experience as it says elsewhere in these teachings. It's not exactly an object of perception as Dogen put it, but it changes your perception. So I get the idea that they just were so intense in their practice and the times were so hard that they just had transformative experiences like epiphany. And they could see the radiant nature of reality. They could hear it. They could feel it. And that's our training in Zen is like that's all sensory. The very first of the lines in the Heart Sutra says, given emptiness, no eye, ear, nose, tongue, body, mind, no seeing, hearing, smelling, tasting, touching, thinking. It doesn't mean the absolute absence of that. It just means not the way you think they are.
Yeah.
Our senses are
Let me
different
interrupt
from.
you for a second.
Yeah,
Let me interrupt you for a second. Craig's got a comment or a question. You're muted.
Apparently, I was muted. So I was just wanting to comment on what Sensei just said about having that one focal point, just being in that one practice and not diverging from on another path. We have a saying over here that you can be a jack of all trades and be a master of none. So I'm kind of meddling all my hands in different pies,
Yep.
and you know what? I'm not really a master of any of them. And somebody else, I heard this one recently as well. It's better to produce one masterpiece than it is to produce 1,000 levels of mediocre.
Yep.
So if we really concentrate on what's right in front of us, then I think we would. I know I personally would benefit from not getting so distracted. I think we're in an age now where there are so many distractions. I've got my phone here. I've got stuff going on in the background. I've got stuff going on outside. And we just really have so many distractions. I think we've lost the art of actually coming in and just doing nothing. I think the Dalai Lama in his book, the Joy of Happiness, he mentioned just is that there's so few people that can actually just come in and sit with themselves. They have to have a distraction like a TV going on in the background or music going on because they're used to that level of distraction.
Yeah, there was a survey conducted. People said about what are you most afraid of, and they were most afraid of being alone with their thoughts. That was the big number one. So Dogen says things like that. He says doing one practice is practicing completely. But it doesn't mean that you only do one thing. Obviously, you have to do multiple things to live and to do anything. But there's another trope or expression about it, like if you want to find water, would you drill a lot of shallow wells or drill one deep well? And anybody who's ever been around well water knows you drill one deep well, right? So Zen is like that. Taoism is like that. It's not so much rejecting all the various multiplicity of things that we have to do on a daily basis. It's just seeing them as all the same practice. They're all the same practice. Variations on it. Let me run through this. Yeah.
Go ahead, sir. Go ahead with what you have, and then
I'll just run through this. Okay, keep your thought. So it gives rise to form. So they had this intuitive sense that something is behind everything. And we call it, in Zen, we call it emptiness, or the Tao. Though vague and elusive, it gives rise to shapes, though dark and obscure and so forth. But is it real? I say its evidence is all of creation. So it sounds like God, and in our milieu, it doesn't matter if you call it God or not. It's simply semantics. You can call it whatever you want. We don't argue the existence of God or non-existence of God. But it's like an extra word. We have this cosmic Buddha idea that the universe is the cosmic Buddha's body, and everything else is manifestations of this Buddha nature, which means being awake or conscious, which is referred to here. So then from the first moment to the present, the name has been sounding. It sounds again like the word, right in the Bible. The word was the beginning of creation. And this guy, Wayne Dyer, apparently is Christian because he uses a lot of Christian references in his text. It is the gate through which the universe enters, the witness by which the universe sees. Now, Okamura Roshi, one of my teachers, Japanese Zen, and he said, we human beings, we, and all sentient beings really, but particularly human beings, we are the universe becoming conscious of itself. So it's sort of the miracle of life, the miracle of consciousness. Nobody understands or can explain this. Religious belief systems have the myth of creation, this and that. They try to explain it, but I think, if you nailed them down, they would admit that there's a certain level of just don't know, agape, awestruck, the miracle of existence. Nobody can fully explain. How have I come to know all this? The very name has told me, the name which is sounding right here, right now. And in the other one, they say, how do I know? I look inside myself and see what is within me. So these two things are not in competition with each other. Name and form, nama rupa, form is usually connected to name, meaning we name things like the floor, the wall, the coffee cup, the tea, what this, that, and then we think we know them by having named them. So somewhere the Tao says, and Buddy, you guys would know more than I, it says something like, naming is the source of all particular things, but that which is eternally real is nameless. So we recognize the duality of language in Taoism, Buddhism, probably in most religions, that you cannot really capture this in words because the language itself is dualistic. So the very names we use, especially, and this especially applies to your self-identity, we don't self-identify as Buddhists. As I often say, Buddha was not a Buddhist. Christ was not a Christian. What grew up around them and what followed is what we call Buddhism and Christianity, but that's not what they were. They were as we are. And there's an old line in one of the Zen poems says, Buddhas and ancestors of old were as we. We in the future shall be Buddhas and ancestors. So there's a self-identity that doesn't have any particular form to it that we call Buddha nature. It is formless because it is shared by everything. Everything is an example of it. So these things are very close to Buddhist or Zen principles in this particular verse.
Sensei, you have something, Chris?
No, I mean, so many things have come to mind. It's hard to know what to ask. Yeah, I'm thinking of things we name that don't necessarily have form, sort of intangible things, like maybe, for example, behavior of people. We describe characteristics of things. Blue doesn't have form, does it? I don't know. Maybe it does.
What doesn't have form?
Blue, the color blue.
Blue, right.
Yeah.
Well, it's interesting you bring that up. Sokean was a Rinzai master who came over with Shoin Shaku in late 1800s for the first convocation of world religions, where for the first time Buddhism was introduced to the West. I think it was held in Chicago. And then apparently Shoin Shaku directed Sokean, who was a student, to either stay behind or come back because he ended up forming the New York Zen Institute. And he published a column called The Cat's Yawn. And he was known for a lot of things. But he had this one analogy that he used. He said the cat, the dog, and the chicken, the dog, and the person all see the fire hydrant. He's in New York, right? And he said, but only the person sees the red. So where is the red? And he used this to define two different kinds of what are called dharmas. Dharmas are understood as beings or truths, reality. Dharma means teachings. It has a lot of meanings. But in this case, it's referring to a particle as a dharma, or a cat as a dharma, or a dog, or you or I, or this house, or anything is a dharma being. It has its dharma location in space-time, which nothing else occupies. So he said the fire hydrant is an example of a real and existent dharma. You kick it with your toe, you'll hurt your toe, But he said the red is a real but non-existent Dharma. In other words, if I say red, you know what I mean. And, I could point out this wall behind me is red, and you'd say, yes, that's red. It looks red. And something in your own room that looks red. But we know that it would be impossible for any two of us to see the same color, actually, because we're all constructed slightly differently. Close enough for jazz, right? And unless you're colorblind, you're not going to confuse green and red or blue and red and so forth. But he said, where is the red? It doesn't exist for the chicken or the dog. And so it's a real but non-existent Dharma. And we know that if we take the electron microscope again and put the fire hydrant under it, we begin to see that what we consider real and existent Dharmas are also real but non-existent in the sense that they're mostly space, energy, and that they are ever changing and impermanent over time. So it's interesting that you chose the color blue. But this goes to the skandha of what is called mental formations. You have and perception, but you have the 5 skandhas. It starts with form or the material world. That's the grossest basic level. And then it goes to sensation. So when you're sitting in meditation long enough, the boundary between your butt and the cushion becomes fuzzy, turns into sensation. And then it goes into perception and conception, the middle skandha. Then what is called mental formations, motive, impulse, desire, etc. And finally, consciousness itself is the 5th of all the skandhas. So you would put blue in that area of perception where we identify a color vibration, which modern physics tells us is the amount of the spectrum of light that is absorbed by the surface and the amount that is reflected, and the wavelengths, right? So a red fire hydrant is going to reflect a different wavelength than is a blue sweater. And that's how the quote blue, that's where the blue exists, but it's not really findable because it doesn't have a location. It's somewhere between our perception and the object and the light reflecting off the object. It's a very elusive thing, but that is what is called a real but non-existent Dharma. And the Indians, they had a model for all of this. They could talk about it, but they didn't have any more solid answer than you or I have.
Hey, Chris, you have anything else, sir?
No, thank you. That's very good.
You. Heidi. Oh, you're muted, dear. There you go.
So I don't know if you have time to do this, but I was looking up duality, and I don't understand it. And I was wondering if maybe he could give a quick rundown.
The difference between duality and non-duality?
Yeah.
Okay.
How much time you got?
Yeah.
Let's see. The simplest thing would be you are now perceiving us on your monitor, and you are you and us is us, and that's the same for all of us. And so there's this separation. There's this seeming duality. But on the other hand, you are not separate from this conversation. So on the other hand, you're part of it. So a simple analogy might be the skin. We think of the skin as separating us from everything else, right? This is where I end, everything else begins. But the skin also connects us to everything else. So it works both ways. It's a two-way street kind of thing. We emphasize the duality in our education system, our jobs, our training. It's all about logical thinking and learning to control the universe. There's a line in a Chinese poem that says, existing phenomenally like box and cover joining. And I put the word but in there, but, however, according with principle, like arrow points meeting. So this is posing the two. This is like saying duality is what we understand. It's the way we think. The nature of language is itself dual. You can't say all the truth. You can only say half of it. If I say cold, I'm already saying hot. but I'm not saying hot. I'm saying cold. But you can't have cold without hot. If I say light, it's already saying dark. Okamura Roshi said, when you say form, you're already saying emptiness. When you say emptiness, you're already saying form. So this is, in a dualistic Western culture, this is difficult to get our head around. And I don't think anybody understands it. I don't think anybody really gets it. It's a mystery. But this duality versus non-duality comes down to, finally, all of these dyads, or what do we call them today? What's the computer word for it? It's like binaries, right? All of these things sort of subsume into one big glob of all of these ideas in which you have something opposed to something else. And they're typically opposite ends of the extreme of a spectrum on which all these other intervals exist, like colors on a spectrum, sound is on a spectrum, etc. Now we say gender diversity, gender is on a spectrum, etc. So because the language is dualistic, you can only sort of talk about half of it at a time. You can't talk about the other part. If you say cold, it's already implying warm. Whatever feels cold has to be warmer than the cold it's feeling. The baby in the womb is the same temperature as the womb, so it doesn't feel the temperature. And that's the other point of it. Cold and warm subsume into a larger category called temperature. And all of these duals are like that. All these dyads are opposed, things that seem to be opposites, are really complementary, like the yin and yang symbol, the black and white, rotating. And there's a line in the poem says, there's darkness in light, but do not take it as darkness. There's light in darkness, but do not see it as light. Light and dark oppose one another, like the front and back foot in walking. So the front and back foot in walking are always becoming their opposite. The front foot is becoming the back foot, and the back foot is becoming the front foot. So it's like the yin-yang cycle. Everything is like that. And so the unification in non-duality comes about through this. And the last line of Trust in Mind says, living in this faith is the road to this trust in mind with a big M, is the road to non-duality, because the non-dual is one with the trust in mind. So we have to kind of give up our logic and give up our analysis and our anxiety to sort of embrace this idea with a trusting mind for the non-duality of our world to become apparent. And meditation does that. You sit still enough, long enough, you're pushing that envelope, it's going to break that down, and you're going to come into a, as Dogen says, in stillness, in deep, deep stillness and meditation, in stillness, mind and object merge in realization, go beyond enlightenment. So mind and object are one of the fundamental dualities. As I was saying in the beginning, you see yourself as separate from but aware of all the rest of us on this call, and each of us see that same way. But in stillness, mind and object merge in realization and go beyond enlightenment. So actually, we're not separate. We're not entirely separate, I should say.
Heidi, have you heard me talk about the hand to the body? Okay. Yeah, you've experienced the oneness because the great thing is you don't have to understand it for you to benefit from the oneness. You don't have to have an understanding. I don't know if you can have an understanding of this. I don't think that's possible, but you can know it. Okay. And you don't even have to know it for it to benefit you. All you have to do is take the action. And you've been benefiting from the oneness since you've been sober for sure. Because when you got into recovery and you were told to, if you wanted to get over a resentment, to pray for that person that you resented. Okay. That's the same thing as, let's say my hand did not realize it was part of the body and it was talking to the other hand. And it said, I don't understand it. There was this food in front of me. I picked up this apple and I put it up to this mouth, and this mouth ate it. The mouse did nothing for me. And I don't understand, but I felt better. Like the nutrition came through the body, right? And so the hand being part of the body, in the same way when we show love and kindness or love to another person, like in our resentments, when we pray for that person, or we learn in recovery that nothing immunes you against a drink as much as working with another alcoholic. That's the same thing. You're helping the body, so in turn, you're being helped yourself at the same time. So that is that. I think that's that oneness, or that's the way I understand it to be. And
it's also interconnectedness as well. Interconnectedness.
Yeah.
There's a wonderful story in Zen about these gourds, all these gourds, and Okamura had put together a children's book about it. And all these gourds are talking to each other and relating to each other like we are. And one day they noticed the vine. it connects them all. Like, they didn't notice that,
So they weren't all connected. That's just like looking at the hand. Is the hand the body? No. Is the hand part of the body? Yes. You see what I'm saying? That for me, it's that same kind of the same kind of understanding. But I had a question for Sensei. Do you have anything else, Heidi? Okay, thank you. I have a question for Sensei. You mentioned back, Sensei, when we were talking about the end of that second stanza, I say its evidence is all of creation. And if I remember correctly, you said that in Zen, you don't look at that. You look at that creation as emptiness. Did I hear you correctly?
It's both. That's nowadays we have this trope. Both things can be true at the same time. So that's the way I think we approach emptiness and form, is that they're both true at the same time. They're not competing with each other. They're not competitive ideas. Things exist by nature of emptiness, by virtue of emptiness. Change. Mm-hmm. Emptiness is change, impermanence, etc. Mm-hmm. So that's how things exist. The question in Zen is not whether things are real or not, or whether they exist or not, but how they exist. It's more a scientific question. And how they exist is by nature of impermanence, ever changing. This year's garden dies and becomes compost for next year's. This generation has to die off to make room for the next generation to come along of each species. Another good one on the hands is Sensei explained the bow, the Buddhist bow, this bow, not a prayer, not a worship form, but it's more, he said, this hand represents the person we don't like and we're trying to improve or get rid of or whatever. This person, this hand represents the ideal. In Buddhism, it's the Buddha nature. We aspire to the Buddha nature. He said they're coming together like this illustrates that they're not separate. They're just one thing. They're parts of the same body. As the hands seem to be separate, but they're actually just part of the same being. And so the Buddha nature, awakened nature we aspire to, is the same as the nature we have to work with, the material we have to work with. And by the way, it's the same as what Buddha had to work with. So when I bow to you, it means I recognize your Buddha nature, same as mine. Then we use it as a form of respect, entering the Zendo and so forth, appreciation for the ability to practice. And the other dualistic side of things that is often used as an analogy is this hand can grasp everything except itself. And in grasping itself, that's when we move into the non-dual.
Sensei, on the last stanza in the Starr translation, how have I come to know all this? That very name has told me, that name which is sounding right here, right now. Like it's bringing us to the moment.
So
I've been thinking about it. Go ahead, I'm sorry.
Yeah, many forms of meditation, including Zen, emphasize deep listening. And the way I think about it, this same idea is dukkha is this kind of profound concept from Buddhism, probably came from Hinduism or Vedic, but it means, we translate it as suffering, which is kind of a poor translation. It's a very human-centric translation, suffering, and oh, poor baby, poor me, But it's more change. As I often say, galaxies colliding are dukkha. It's impersonal. It's a universal principle. The existence of suffering is universal in scope. But we get caught up in it as human beings. We address it as suffering. We complain, we don't like it. We'd rather things not change that we don't want to change, and we'd rather some things change that seem stubbornly refuse to change. So if you think of it as change rather than suffering, then you have to recognize that every sound you hear, including the sound of my voice, my hearing the sound of your voice, sound of cars going by or tinnitus and internal sounds we hear, every one of those sounds is a sound of change. If nothing changed, you wouldn't hear anything. Same for seeing, same for feeling. So everything we feel, hear, and see is change. If the light wasn't bouncing off these surfaces and hitting my retina, I wouldn't see anything. If the vibrations in the environment that are compressing the air, creating sound or going through the headphones, I wouldn't hear anything. So I think it's a very simple thing to wake up to, that everything you experience, Heidi's yawn, that's change. Everything is change. And so we are hearing the sound of dukkha at all times. We are feeling the sensation of dukkha at all times. We're seeing dukkha at all times. It's the ever-present reality. It's not a special thing called suffering that we don't like. It's just change. And in doing that, you see that any sound you hear is this name or the word of God. Every sound you hear is reality manifesting itself in sound.
Thank you, Sensei. Oh, by the way, Heidi, if you ever want to know if you're in a room with a lot of people, my daughter told me about this. She said that if you ever want to know if anybody's checking you out and you're like at a party or something, yawn. And then anyone that yawns was checking you out. So you feel free to use that sometime if you're ever there. So I wonder who's checking me out. Do a big yawn and take a look around and see.
And if nobody yawns, you'll be depressed.
Right?
I have to say that Buddy, he yawns a lot around 9 a.m. It just comes to him there. I don't know if this is a sleep pattern or what.
Yeah, when I come over to meet with you, it gets me out of bed super early on Wednesdays. So I'm already yawning at that time. Yeah, Dennis, thank you. Anyone else got a comment for Sensei or a question? Chris?
Well, a comment on this thing of impermanence. I mean, I guess in sobriety, we're told to accept things as they are. And so you start your day off and you say, well, I'm going to do this and this and this today. And you're bound to have trouble. You basically have to say, that things are going to change. What is changing today?
Right.
And yet we crave constancy, don't we? We build houses strong so that we can always come back to our house. Yeah.
I think I'm an amateur musician, and we have a lot of musicians in the community, the Sangha. And so we tend to sort of translate these concepts from Buddhism into musical analogies and so forth. And one would be polyrhythm. Everything is changing, but apparently at different rates. That is, the mountains don't change as quickly as the trees on the mountains. The trees drop their leaves and grow, and et cetera, et cetera. And the mountains seem to stay relatively constant. So it's like a cacophony of different rhythms, polyrhythms going on at all times, and they're synchronous with each other. Every once in a while they come around and they hit, now we say, okay, now it's winter, so it's like there's a commonality. So I don't think we can interpret change as being all equal and the same. It's variable, like a symphony, or like it's like music. It's more like music than mathematics or something, even though mathematics and music are the same. But chaos, we look at chaos as a higher form of order. It's just a more complex order than we can comprehend. And yet we still sense that it has to be an underlying order.
There's a Taoist phrase that talks about, and it's not word for word, but can we let go of what has died so that we can grasp the new thing that's coming, because we want to hold on to things, and I think that's a big part of recovery, is learning how to accept the moment for what the moment is, and being okay with that. And for me, that only comes from letting go of my fears of things not being, of things harming, all my fears of financial insecurity and all the other things. I'll try to hold on to things because of my fears. So it helps when I work through the steps and surrender a lot of those fears. I can be more accepting of the moment. Dennis.
But the idea of trust runs through all of these teachings that we have. Mark Twain was asked at the end of his life, wasn't he afraid of dying? He said, how could I be afraid of returning to where I came from? You think about it, we celebrate birth and we mourn death, and it doesn't really make any sense. They're both inflection points in life. I mean, you can imagine living eternally. You can imagine that. But would you really want to? That's another question.
Dennis,
yes.
Yeah.
I was just thinking about what we talked about yesterday from Katie Byron. That's another way of saying the Tao and all that you fall in love with what is. And I could see that especially in the second stanza, and what we're talking about here, both with duality and how it merges. It merges when I become aware that my perception always needs that contra thing. I can't have anything good without the bad, and so on. That's how the simplest way I can understand the duality, if I externalize it. And I say I can't understand the light without darkness, and so on. And we can kind of make that very confusing in a long explanation. But if I accept it for what it is, then I can kind of narrow it down, which comes a lot through stillness of the mind, I'm guessing. And
in Zen practice in daily life, I come to emphasize the idea of vacillation, that the mind tends to work by vacillating between extremes. And you can't really know the middle or the mean without going to extremes. The metaphor that's used is the airplane with two computers, and the airplane lands in Seattle. But 99% of the time it's off course, and one computer is telling the other we're off course, and the other computer is correcting. So it's like a sine wave. So if we accept the vacillation as part of the way we work, then we don't mind so much when we're down or when we're manic, bipolar up and down, or the roller coaster. We recognize that is the way it works. And so the only thing is really to correct, and just recognizing it, you automatically correct. It's when we get to the point that we don't recognize that we're off the beam, they can get problematic.
Yeah, somebody asked me if I thought they were crazy. I said, someone who's crazy, they don't ask that question.
Yeah, the question in Buddhism or this whole thing about enlightenment is, for a truly enlightened person, can enlightenment exist? How could it?
Sensei, isn't enlightenment just being present in this moment, fully present?
I think that's more along the lines of awareness, or what's called bare awareness.
Exactly.
And in Zen, we have this phrase, the sickness of falling into the moment. So just being in the moment doesn't mean everything is cool. Your whole life may be falling apart all around you, and you're simply not paying attention, but you're still in the moment.
Why is that being called a sickness, by the way? That's interesting. It's a sickness to fall into the moment, but that's the beautiful part of it, right?
Yeah, because it tends to ignore consequences through the three times, cause and effect, causality in the three times, karmic consequence. You cannot escape consequences simply by staying in the moment. That's it's taught as a palliative or a corrective, because mostly we're distracted. We're thinking in the future, planning, and we're regretting the past, and we're not in the moment. But simply coming into the moment is not it. That's part of it, but it's not the whole thing. Embracing in the moment those things that are consequences that we may not like, is part of it.
Part of that, accepting the moment for what it is, and that would be embracing those things, right?
Yes, Shunryu Suzuki said something interesting. He was pressed by David Chadwick to explain Zen in a bumper sticker, just briefly, and he said, "Things as it is." Another one he said was, "Everything changes." But he said, "Things as it is." Now, that's incorrect English. So it doesn't mean things as they are. It means things as they really are. Things as it is. In other words, things as reality is. Everything included. And yet we think we know that, but we don't know it exactly. This is another dualistic conundrum. Until we penetrate through our own sort of ego-driven projection of our reality. We all know from brain science that we're sort of projecting this reality. It's not exactly as we perceive it. And Dogen makes the point: all this, however, does not appear within perception, because it is unconstructedness in stillness. It is immediate realization. So the way I think about it is it comes from behind and changes our perception, so to speak. So it's not something that we necessarily register as perception. That's what they're trying to get at here by saying, though vague and elusive, right? Sensei says, round and rolling, slippery and slick, like a bar of soap. You try to grasp it, you can't grasp it. If you stop grasping, then it embraces it like incense smoke. If you try to grasp the incense smoke, it evades your grasp. But if you stop grasping, then it embraces your palm. So this is the difficult thing to do, to stop, to stop our knee-jerk compulsive and sit back, let it come to us.
Yeah, thank you. Dennis?
Isn't, this is also a question for Sensei, isn't awareness the consciousness, and the other way around also? So consciousness is the awareness. Does that make any sense?
Yeah, consciousnness applies to earthworms. It applies probably to viruses to some degree. It's a broad term. And all sentient beings who have senses have a degree of awareness. And we think we're on the top of the food chain, and we have more awareness than any other sentient being, especially self-awareness. But there clearly are birds and other animals that see much broader spectrum than we do. They see infrared, ultraviolet. Dogs have much better smell than we have, cats and so forth, and whales, who knows, dolphins and octopi or octopuses, whatever they're called. Awareness, the kind of awareness we approach in our meditative practice, is often called bare awareness, meaning it has been stripped down of all of its predilections, preconceptions, etc. And it's like a regression, like returning to childhood. When you're 3 or 4 years old, you didn't have much going on up here. That you were fully conscious and you were aware of everything. And your awareness was very sharp, and you were processing an awful lot of information on a subliminal level. But you didn't have language, you didn't have concepts, you didn't have words, et cetera, et cetera. So that's the fundamental original mind. It is extremely powerful. And we have learned to trust our analytical aspect of that mind, get the good grades, get the good jobs, compete, and so forth. And that's basically the way we make cultural evolution work. The box and cover joining, we've learned to control our environment to the point that we've over-controlled it, and now we may be destroying the environment, by our, quote, control of it. So this idea in meditation is you relinquish all of that and you return to a more primordial kind of mind, which is always there, has always been there. And, but in most cases, it's not very highly valued. In art and music and other places, intuition is credited and valued. But we've definitely gotten out of balance. We're way over on the side of chitta, or discriminating mind, monkey mind, we call it. And the intuitive side, bodhi mind, wisdom mind, is sort of pushed into the background. So we think the meditative process helps bring that back into better balance.
Does that answer your question?
Sense.
Yeah, a little bit. I was just seeing if it emerged together, and I think that's what I'm getting out of that you can be aware of the consciousness, and awareness is the consciousness.
You can be conscious of the other five are called form, feeling, thought, impulse, and consciousness. So you could say consciousness is sort of the uber skandha or uber aggregate. You're aware of form, conscious of form. You are conscious of sensation. You're conscious of perception and conception. You're conscious of motive, desire, underlying everything, right? So consciousness is kind of the uber aggregate that can be conscious of the other four. But the principle in meditation is that you sort of leave them all behind gradually until you find yourself sitting in consciousness only, is the way it's described. So consciousness is conscious of consciousness. So consciousness is studying consciousness through consciousness and not really anymore analyzing perception, form, feeling, and so forth. It's consciousness becoming aware of consciousness itself. And that would be something akin to bare awareness, where everything else has fallen away. And now we're back to sort of an original state of mind.
That makes sense. I got it there. Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Any other questions for Sensei before we close? We're coming up on the hour. Saw a couple of hands go up and then they went down. Either one of you guys still have a question, Craig?
Don't start him up again.
I was just checking on Heidi. Just make sure you got that, Heidi.
It's being lit, man. I'm like, I'm off. I'm like feeling so relaxed. It's the best.
If somebody had asked me to describe,
breathe.
If I was asked to describe the difference between the duality and the non-duality, I would have pretended my camera froze and then then just quickly exited the meeting. Thanks very much for your time, Sensei. As always, it's been absolutely fantastic.
Yes.
Great
Sensei,
conversation.
you're our favorite guest. You're our only guest, but you're our favorite still.
If we had another one, you would still be the best.
Chris, you have something?
Tell everybody to buy my book. Follow my podcast on Monday.
I'll still have the link up for both in the notes. Chris, you have something to close us out with?
Well, yeah, I think. Well, and it's an idea. With meditation and being in the moment, it's the only way I can really know what to do next. What's the next best thing? So since it gets me out of thinking in the future or in the past, right? It's the best tool for.
And even in complicated situations, like the last 4 podcasts or so have been about the mass shootings, the school shootings, and all of that. Even in situations like that, and I'm correlating design thinking and Zen, where in design thinking the whole issue is to define the problem thoroughly, and don't leap to a solution, but spend your time defining the problem. And if you thoroughly define the problem, probably the best solution will be inherent in the definition. And so I think Zen is very much like that. Buddha defined the problem of existence, and he called it dukkha, the middle way, and so forth. And unfortunately, we translate those into limited ideas like suffering. So, but I think Buddha was like a master designer. He built a program and he built a community around this idea. He didn't go against the political system of the time. Notice that he didn't do that like Jesus did. But he built an alternative and invited people to join him in that alternative. And that's very much a design prototype approach. So I think there's a lot of parallels between design thinking and Zen.
Hey, Sensei, have you done any study on? There's a large belief that Jesus, between the ages of 12 and 29, went and studied Buddhism. And there's some books, and there's a lot of them.
It's like 4 missing years or something, but I think that long ago there had to be a lot of missing years in the record. And the theory was that he was close enough to the Silk Road that he got exposed to Buddhism.
Yeah, exactly. So, and the ideas he brought back and taught were more Buddhist ideas than they were Jewish ideas.
There's a really good book that you guys might want to look up. It's called The Zen Teachings of Jesus. And it was written by a Zen priest who was also a Jesuit, if I recall correctly. It's not a new book. It's been out. I read it a long, long time ago. But I think he went back to the original translations or the original Greek or something, went back as far as he could, and he tried to communicate what Jesus actually said. And he illustrates how close they are to a lot of the teachings of Buddha.
Well, if there's nothing else, guys, any other quick questions? It's time to close. Sensei, thank you today, sir. We appreciate you. We all have a great week then, and we will see you next week.
Hello, this is Buddy C. I wanted to make you aware of several recovery-related resources that I've posted in the episode description. These resources include a list of recovery podcasts, a free sober meditation app, daily recovery email, shared Google recovery calendars. Hope you put some of these resources to use and have a great week.
Thank you for listening to the Tao of Our Understanding Recovery Podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, please share it with your friends in recovery.